Hello and welcome to Redaction Report. With me, your host, James Moules, co-editor of Redaction Report. So we're about a month departed now from an absolute election extravaganza here in the UK, probably the biggest you'll ever see outside of a general election. Obviously, a lot of elections were delayed due to the COVID pandemic from last year. So we've had local elections across the country for local councils. We've had a very prominent by-election in a certain northern constituency. I think that's going to generate a lot of discussion. We've had Scottish Parliament elections, Welsh Parliament elections, London Assembly elections, and several mayor elections. So there's a heck of a lot to unpack here, but we're going to do our best. So joining me today is our journalists, Kit Roberts and Richard Hansen. How's it going, guys?
Very well. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Good stuff. So yes, as I alluded to a moment ago, there was a big by-election in the northern constituency of Hartlepool. So this is very traditionally a solid Labour constituency, very left-leaning, but this time round it went to the Conservative Party. Now there's a lot of background to this. So it was a heavily Leave voting seat in the 2016 Brexit referendum. Around 70% of the constituency voted to leave the EU. The candidates up in the by-election included a Dr. Paul Williams, who stood for the Labour Party, and he gathered 28.7% of the vote, which is pretty low for the Labour Party in such a traditionally Labour bulwark. And he lost to Jill Mortimer of the Conservative Party, who got 51.9% of the vote. This is often seen as a red wall constituency, and in the 2019 general election, a lot of these traditional Labour constituencies in the north of England that had voted Brexit changed allegiance to the Conservative Party. What's there to make of this result? Is anyone surprised?
No, absolutely not. Not at all. So a couple of things to say to kick it off. I think Labour were very silly putting a very pro-European candidate in there. If you look at the vote share that he got, it was roughly the same amount of Remain vote that they got in the 2016 referendum. So that goes to show who's been voting for them. Also, an interesting thing, I think, was that, reading things and speaking to people in the lead up to it, a lot of people were saying things like, I'm going to vote Conservative this time because it's been made clear to us that if we want to have funding at a local level, we need to have a Conservative MP. So the government seems to have done quite well in making making people aware that they will perhaps prioritise their areas, but only if they're on the right side. They're not going to be throwing money at Labour constituencies. They're going to be throwing money at Conservative constituencies. And I mean, obviously, it remains to be seen. We're only a month or so out from that result, but it may have been enough to, well, certainly swing a few votes towards them.
Well, I think
yes,
I think
that
echo that really, because speaking in a more kind of general sense as well, a lot of these, tend to be northern constituencies, very Leave-leaning constituencies. Obviously, we've seen that in the 2019 general election, but we've also seen that in 2017 as well. It's just that the swing wasn't quite enough to actually push things over the edge, push the seats over the edge. So if you look at the swing in 2017, there was already quite a big swing towards the Tories in a lot of these red wall seats, but it was only in 2019 that there was that final kind of push over the edge that's kind of brought everything down. So, and speaking in a more kind of general sense, it's almost just like the sort of last little bit has sort of fallen from it, basically. It's if you have, like Richard highlighted, the debate being drawn up less along kind of traditional class lines and economic arguments, and it's more about Brexit, it's more about identity politics and social conservatism and that kind of stuff.
It's also about home ownership. If you look at the statistics about, forget working class, middle class, forget Leave, forget Remain. If you just literally look at which constituencies have the highest amount of people who own their own homes, they're more likely to vote Conservative. And in many of these working class towns, there are high levels of home ownership, and the population are probably older as well, so they're more likely to own their own home. Conversely, there are plenty of renters in Islington and other sort of, London boroughs that are always going to be voting Labour. So, yeah, I think there might be a bit of a fundamental realignment happening.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've hit the bottom line there. Is people will ultimately vote for what they think is in their own interest.
Indeed.
And let's dig into some statistics here, because it's actually interesting looking at just how much the swing has been. In 2017, this was an election which the Conservatives won, but Labour did unexpectedly well. The Tory majority, which had been before, was demolished, and Labour made gains for the first time in 20 years. So in that election in Hartlepool, Labour got about 52% of the vote, and they got about, in terms of the raw vote, they got about 21,000 votes to the Conservatives, 14,000-ish. In 2019, this is an interesting one. Labour got 37.7% of the vote. They still won the constituency. They got about 15,000 votes. The Conservatives, 11,000-ish votes. 11.8 thousand, that is, so closer to 12. And the Brexit Party got 10.6 thousand votes, roughly. So if you add those two together, of course, that would beat the Labour Party. But here's the interesting thing in what just happened in this by-election. Conservatives, 51.9% of the vote, Labour, 28.7% of the vote. But the Conservatives got 15.5 thousand votes. That's only just over 1,000 more than they got in 2017, despite winning the constituency. Whereas Labour's just got 8.5-ish% of the vote. Sorry, not in terms of raw votes, 8.5 thousand.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're looking at plenty of Labour voters, people who voted Labour in 2017 and 2019 staying home. And I think it ties into the argument of, well, what did Labour really stand for? Aside from being not the Tories, it's not a particularly well-rounded election-winning argument to say vote for us because we're not them. If you want to, I think if you want to boil down why Labour haven't been doing as successful, I think it's probably it's two things. It's it's the pandemic, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. And it's obviously a good time to be an incumbent, with the possible exception of the US and Brazil. But the fact that Labour didn't bring a positive message of change or of alternative government. I know it was only in a local election context, but you said, I mean, I'm sure he did have a slogan, but can you tell me what Paul Williams was standing for? Could you tell me what his main manifesto points were? I mean, I know none of us are from Hartlepool, but I'm sure if we went and walked the streets and went into the local Wetherspoons,
we should clarify.
Sorry.
Neither was Dr. Paul Williams.
Well, indeed, that makes a big difference in these sorts of places. Somebody who people could tell was not from around here, didn't share the values of the people in the northeast. It would have been much more sensible, in my humble opinion, to put somebody in there who was from the local area, who was perhaps certainly sympathetic to the fact that they may not have thought it was a good idea to leave the European Union, but they could at least be sympathetic to the fact that 70% of their constituency did. So, we can argue whether it's a good idea or not till the cows come home, but 70% of the people voted for it. So arguably you've got to do something about that. And so, yeah, it seems to be a few open goals there that they missed.
I think probably the big rationale behind Paul Williams was that he's an NHS doctor.
Yes.
And given that we're in the midst of a pandemic and a massive soaring respect for the NHS as a result of the pandemic, and especially as a result of the vaccine rollout.
Yeah,
so that was probably a large part of the rationale behind his candidacy. But at the same time, there's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah, indeed. And it does. To be honest, it suggests to me that there was a focus group somewhere with some chocolate biscuits involved, where people said, okay, what do you Hartlepool voter value the most in the whole country other than your family? And they'll probably say the NHS, and absolutely right. But it's a little bit one-dimensional for me. I think in places like that, I think you need to have somebody who has roots in the area and is going to connect with people on an individual level. I'm not sure how good he would have been on the doorstep if he's an NHS doctor and he's had experience in other parts of the country. And I mean, goodness me, I mean, he's surely been fairly busy in the last 12, 13, 14 months doing other things other than electioneering. So,
Well, there was that time when Keir Starmer was up there campaigning, and he went for a photo op with Paul Williams. They were there having their fish and chips, and that's how you win over the northern voters, isn't it? You just go there and have your fish and chips, and that's why they vote for you.
Yeah.
Because that's what the north likes, doesn't it?
And get the photo opportunity, and be able to have it published in every newspaper up and down the land. But I think if there was someone who could connect on a one-on-one individual level, I think they would have been much more successful. They probably still wouldn't have won. I mean, they got absolutely spanked, but it would have been a hell of a lot closer than 51-28.
Yes.
Well, what is really interesting is that the Conservative Party is somehow managing to push this message of change in these constituencies as well. Even though we've had a Conservative government for about 11 years now, a lot of these places have had Labour councils throughout a lot of that time. So a lot of the blame for central government policies, for stuff like austerity, for example, gets pushed over onto the Labour council, because they're the ones that ultimately have to make the decisions as to the services that get cut, even though they just get handed the budget from central government. So when you have, I've seen it here in Stoke-on-Trent as well, obviously we no longer have a Labour council here, but people still blame the council, meaning Labour, because those two things are just so synonymous with each other. So I think somehow managing to promote this message of a change of scene, despite 11 years of government, I think is quite a feat, I think, in some ways.
You agree with it or disagree with it, you at least know what they stand for.
Yeah.
That exactly, you might be the most vehement Brexiteer, and you're at least going to know what they stand for, and you might agree with it. But I do believe until Labour come up with a credible alternative vision for the country, they're going to remain out of government at all levels, local or national.
It's almost an impossible scenario for them as a party, really, because it's very difficult to launch. Like you said, highlighted earlier, it's a good time to be an incumbent at the moment, despite the kind of multiple failures of the Conservative government during the pandemic. It's almost impossible to put together a credible programme as an opposition leader or as an opposition party when you have a time of national crisis going on, because you could say, well, how will we do this differently? Well, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to roll out the vaccine, we need to isolate people. It's very difficult to put together a program of government in a more general sense when you have this one issue that's just dominating everything all the time.
Yes, without a doubt. And I think in 6-12 months time, perhaps, when where they have the pandemic fully behind us, or at least as behind us as it's ever going to get, it's going to be a time for Labour to cut through, and it's just unfortunate they had to go through this election trouncing before that happened. And also, I mean, for all the Conservative Party's failings of the pandemic, for which there are many, and we probably need a whole other podcast series to talk about that, the vaccine rollout has been largely very successful, and the vaccine rollout is probably the last thing that will happen, and it's probably the thing that most people will remember, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, I mean, it's obviously a very good thing, but from a Labour Party point of view, they're going to find it hard to cut through and say, look, the Tories didn't do very well on the pandemic. There were 127,000 people dead, and chaos up and down the land as far as you can see. But I got my jab, and I can go to the pub now. And it's that level of baseline politics, I think, that they need to tap into.
Well, then another thing that I think we're definitely going to see in the coming months is, as the economy reopens and people start getting out and about again, we are going to see a bounce. In actual real terms, that's not going to be like a recovery. It's not going to be meaningful. But if you look at the graphs, it's going to look like one. And it's going to be very easy to have that visual for the Conservative Party to say, look, we've started an economic recovery, even though it's literally just the economy starting to reopen and starting to kind of operate on something resembling normality, right? Yeah. But if you have that visual, you have that kind of, well, look, we're bouncing back from the pandemic, we've had that crash, but things are starting to look up again, spending is up, people are going out, obviously because there was nothing happening before, because everyone was stuck at home. But if you have that, it's a big win. You can say, well, the economy's not screwed because we're recovering. Everyone's had their jabs. And again, like you said, it's that imagery, the last things that people are going to remember.
And the opinion polls will probably follow the economic recovery.
Yeah.
But you're right.
Yeah.
I mean,
To what extent is this a failure of messaging on the part of Labour? Because here's an analogy a lot of people have drawn between the COVID crisis is the Second World War. And of course, during the Second World War, we had a Conservative-led government, or we had a national coalition government that included both the Conservatives and Labour. So we had Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, Conservative, Clement Attlee, Labour leader, as Deputy Prime Minister during that time. And at the end of the Second World War, Winston Churchill, enormously popular figure, regardless of his controversial legacy. We won't get into that today. But he lost the 1945 election to Clement Attlee, despite being in government at that time, during the biggest national crisis. I mean, I think it's fair to say a bigger national crisis than we're going through today, a far greater existential threat to this country. What happened? Clement Attlee said, "We've won the war, now we must win the peace." He put forward a vision. Is there a failure on Starmer's part to do something like that?
Well, yes, you said it exactly like that. He put forward a vision. Clement Attlee, we got the NHS out of it. There were many other, building works programs. Putting people back to work, giving people reasons to want to get up in the morning, and obviously rebuilding, our ruined towns and cities. But yeah, you're right. But there was a vision there. So I think Labour could learn a lot from that. I mean, I know, it was a long time ago, and obviously the parallels aren't exact. But yeah, if you present a credible vision, if you don't worry about Brexit, that's gone now. We've left the European Union. We're not going back in anytime soon, right? Start talking about what you can do to make people's lives demonstrably better, and then I think people will be on side, and that's people in the red wall seats, quote unquote, and that's people in metropolitan elite seats as well. I think that's the only way that you're going to be able to bridge that divide between those two sort of warring different parties in terms of what their Brexit opinion is.
I think that's one of the major problems I think that I've started to have with Keir Starmer. I still don't know what it is that he stands for. So I mean, you can look to the past, you can look to his legal work, to the kind of cases that he was taking on, to the kind of like humanitarian stuff and like pro bono stuff that he was doing. But and that gives you some idea as to where he's coming from. But I still don't have an idea as to what he stands for as leader of the Labour Party, right? We haven't really seen any meaningful changes to the manifesto, which okay, that could go one way or the other. But like Richard said, in terms of actually just presenting a vision,
I think this summer will be interesting because he's already committed to kind of going on a tour around the country of these leave voting red wall seats. This could go horribly. I mean, it's going to be good watching. You want to be a journalist covering these things.
Either way, it's going to be fun.
Indeed, but at least you're going to at least, because like you say, this will be interesting. He's not going to be able to get away with just saying, "Hello, I'm Keir Starmer. I'm the leader of the Labour Party. I'm the alternative to conservative government. Vote for me." So right. So he's going to have to set forward some kind of vision. There'll be a party conference in October. Forgive me, but did they have one last year? I mean, October 2020 seems such a long time ago. Did they have a party conference last year? I don't think they did, or at least they had something very, very scaled back.
Virtual one.
Did that? Right. Okay. Well, it certainly didn't cut through.
It was a virtual one.
Sure. But they're going to have a number of opportunities in the next few months, Keir Starmer is anyway, to stamp his mark on the Labour Party. And you're right, Kit, I don't know what he stands for yet either, but I'm prepared, I think, so far anyway, to give him a chance to kind of set forth that vision as we come out of the pandemic. I just hope that they don't lose Batley and Spen and the knives come out for him, and then he doesn't get a chance to have a go at being an opposition leader.
It's I think another problem as well is that whenever there's any kind of hint or allusion that anyone close to Starmer or Starmer himself, whenever they kind of seem to push in any sort of direction, the Labour Party internally just jumps on whoever has done that immediately, right? Starts tearing itself to pieces. There's so much internal strife. There's so much kind of criticism. Like, for example, with Labour Party's approach to foreign policy, for example, do we adopt like an anti-imperialism approach, or do they move into a more kind of, I guess not globalist, but kind of different approach to that, which kind of acknowledges that the UK can be a positive force in the world. But whenever that kind of stuff is brought up, any kind of position is even kind of tentatively approached.
Sorry about that, folks. Our connection dropped for a second there, but we're back with you now. And excuse me if these two segments are now a bit patched together. So we were just finishing up talking about the Hartlepool by-election, where Labour took a bit of a hammering, I think it's fair to say. Let's now move on to some other areas where Labour did quite well, actually. Take Wales, for example, where Labour have now matched their best score ever. They got 30 seats in the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Senedd, as it's called in Welsh, the Senedd Cymru. That's exactly half of the seats. So they didn't quite get a majority, but that's a joint best score ever under Welsh Labour leader Mark Drakeford, who's, among other things, widely seen as a man of the left. He was endorsed by Momentum in his bid for the Welsh Labour leadership a couple of years ago. The Tories also made gains in this election, though. They went up from 11 seats from the previous election to 16 this time round. While Plaid Cymru of the Welsh pro-Welsh Independence Party, the Welsh Nationalist Party, didn't make much of a dent or substantial gains at all. What's there to make of this result? Was this an endorsement of Labour?
Incumbency. You know, we've talked about this in terms of COVID around the world. You look at, there are countless examples of elections, big and small, with the notable exception of the US and Brazil. The pandemic has been good for incumbents because they have an ability to stand up in front of a camera on a daily basis, a lot of the time, and lead, and people were watching. You know, for the first time, kind of ever. That, you know, some people watch those COVID briefings that probably had never engaged with politics in a meaningful way ever before. You know, never voted in any elections, kind of thing. So I think naturally there is going to be a bit of a bounce for incumbents, and it just so happened that that Labour were in charge in Wales, and obviously were able to make some of their own decisions as far as, you know, lockdown is concerned, and, you know, ways to, you know, isolating and, you know, vaccine rollout and things. Obviously, you know, the vaccine is rolling out in Wales the fastest relative, you know, as a percentage of the population, and, you know, you see a similar story in Scotland as well with the SNP. So I think that it was just a case of more of the same. We're not quite out of the woods yet, so let's just stick with what we know.
Yes, I think that's a point that we need to clarify off the bat here, is that of the four nations of the UK, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, Wales has had the fastest vaccine rollout. Albeit not by much. I mean, it's been fast all over the place, but Wales has been, in terms of percentages, ahead of the game. Kit, what do you make of this as well?
Well, I mean, I can only really reflect that, to be honest, because like Richard said, as an incumbent, you have a lot of airtime, and I think as sort of someone who has been leading the fight against COVID in Wales, we've been seeing quite a lot of Mark Drakeford, right? Albeit sometimes in a critical role against the government, but a lot of the time just rolling out policies in Wales. So again, you can own that role, like you can own those policies, and you're in the public eye a lot more than the opposition. I mean, it seems like I know it seems quite a sort of simple explanation, but I mean, if you're not seeing the opposition, then fewer people are going to.
If we're looking at incumbency, though, how do we explain the Conservative gains?
I mean,
how do we explain the Conservative? Well, I mean, obviously this message doesn't cut through for everybody. I mean, there are some people that probably, like in the northwest of England, think, well, if we have Conservative councillors and we have Conservative members of Parliament, then we're more likely to get better funding from central government. I don't have the stats in front of me, but who were they at the expense of? You know, were the Conservative gains at the expense of the Lib Dems? Were they at the expense of Plaid? Were they expensive? Who were they? Well,
there was a big collapse in the UKIP vote.
Yeah,
UKIP had done very well in Wales beforehand, so I think it's. I mean, obviously, I can't account for every single voter for the Welsh Senate, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that a lot of those UKIP votes onto the Conservatives.
Yeah, exactly. And in the same way, you look at the Northeast, obviously there are differences, but there are similarities. The Brexit Party vote from 2019 all went, 98% of it went back to the Conservatives. And so you're probably seeing that in Wales as well. UKIP don't have a platform anymore. We've left the European Union, so arguably they don't have any reason to exist
anymore.
And
Nigel Farage has Brexited himself from UKIP as well. So,
well, quite so. And I think what was it, the London mayor candidate was called Gammons himself. So I'm just going to put that
Gammons.
out.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
There we are.
The satire writing itself there. Although, if I were being cynical, I'd say maybe UKIP did that on purpose to get attention. But who knows?
It's entirely possible. I mean, there were so many candidates in that in that race. There was that one student who specifically asked people to not vote for him, and ended up getting, I think it's certainly a similar amount of votes to Lawrence Fox. So there were a whole bunch of crazy people on that ballot.
I'm going to be bleeping out the name Lawrence Fox, by the way.
Sure.
But no, in all seriousness, let's move on to London, because this was actually quite an interesting race. Because yes, we had Lawrence Fox, who, for those who are blissfully unaware, is an actor here in the UK who has suddenly come out as an anti-woke hero, quote unquote, and is anti-lockdown and has been spreading all sorts of stuff to that end, shall we say. But of course, there were 20 candidates in this field, but it came down, of course, to the two main parties, to the Labour and the Conservatives, the incumbent Sadiq Khan of the Labour Party and of Sean Bailey of the Conservatives. Now, Sadiq Khan was widely expected to run away with this one and potentially even win on the first ballot. To our international viewers, in the London mayor election, works kind of like the French presidential elections, in that there's an initial ballot where it's free for all, and then the two candidates who get the most votes in that first ballot, if none of them get 50% of the vote, advance to a runoff, head-to-head runoff, and of course that always happens. But there was a potential in the polls that Sadiq Khan may actually win it on the first ballot and get that 50% of the vote. But it ended up being unexpectedly close. Why was this?
Well, I mean, you've got the incumbency factor to start with. So obviously, I appreciate you saying that it was closer than some may have expected. But I think in a field that is so big, 20 candidates, something like that, if 18 of them get 0.5%, that's 9% of the vote right there. And the amount of people that were on 0.4% of the vote, 0.6%, 0.5%, 0.8%, these numbers add up. So it's in a lot of ways, it's unsurprising that Sadiq Khan didn't reach 50% on the first ballot. Maybe if Count Binface and all the other also rans perhaps decided to not run, I mean, it would be a lot less exciting. I mean, it would be a lot less like, true democracy, in my opinion. But if that was the case, then yeah, okay, perhaps he would have got over that threshold. But I don't think there's too much to read into why he didn't perform as much as some may have thought he would have.
Yeah, I largely agree with that, to be honest. I mean, there were some entertaining candidates down the ballot. Listen, as you allude to, Count Binface, who, to the uninitiated, this is going to be good fun, is a character that has appeared in as a joke candidate in British politics. He's a guy in a costume, dressed as a space lord, who wears a bucket on his head, and put forward some policies that were quite amusing, including renaming London Bridge Phoebe Waller and completing Crossrail, which I think we can all agree is a good idea.
Yeah, look, a lot. I don't know if you read his manifesto, but I probably agreed with 80% of it. I mean, I'd probably not agree with 80% of the manifesto of a party that I would otherwise vote for. So it's some of his ideas weren't half bad.
I mean, my favourite one was because he ran against Boris Johnson for his constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip in the 2019 election. And one of his policies there, his Brexit stance, was to have a referendum on whether to have a second referendum on Brexit.
I mean, the amount of ideas that were being bounced around, I mean, that's not the worst I've heard.
Yeah. But of course, Sadiq Khan won his re-election there in London, another Labour mayor. Andy Burnham has been a big talking point, though, recently. For the record, this guy is a former Labour MP, pretty high-profile former Labour MP from Manchester. He's currently the Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester. He ran twice to be leader of the Labour Party, once in 2010, once in 2015, both unsuccessfully. In 2015, he was actually initially seen as a favourite before Jeremy Corbyn hit the scene. And now people are touting him as a potential successor to Keir Starmer if his leadership goes south, as it very potentially is looking like it might at the moment. Andy Burnham was re-elected just now as Greater Manchester Metro Mayor on an increased majority. What do you make of the prospects of his political career?
Well, I think the first incident, and probably one of the most pivotal incidents in his career as the mayor of Greater Manchester, was his confronting the government over the COVID bailout budget, right? And even though he drew quite a lot of criticism for that, because in some ways it could have been seen as unsuccessful because the government did walk away from the table, right? It was still seen very much as a regional city, a city that's outside the south of England, that's been okay. It's a lot more prosperous than a lot of other cities, a lot of other places around the area, but which nonetheless has perhaps not received the support from central government that it might otherwise have done for reasons that we've already mentioned, actively kind of calling that policy out on the government. And I think a lot of people, particularly, again, it's a large metropolitan area, which at the moment very much does push it towards the Labour Party, because I think they are becoming much more a party of the sort of metropolitan, socially liberal types. That moment, I think, really solidified his solidarity with the city, I think, to use that term. From that, I definitely think there is a platform for him to move forward into a leadership contest. Absolutely. And I think he definitely does have the public profile to do that, potentially.
He has the unique ability to bridge the gap between the two warring factions of the Labour Party. And I don't mean left and right. I don't mean that. I mean the Brexit leave red wall seats and the metropolitan seats. You know, he's from a metropolitan area. He's done well in Manchester. I put my cards on the table. I voted for him myself. But equally, he will have appeal because he will be able to be more relatable to people who are looking for some leadership in the north and in these sort of ex-working class or ex-mining towns, etc. And not only that, but he's set forth as much of a vision as he can in his position. So like you say, Kit, he has railed against the government's COVID bailouts, money issues. There've been other issues with Manchester being in local lockdown through last year that obviously other parts of the country weren't, so who were perhaps recording slightly higher COVID infection rates, etc., than we were. So yeah, I think he is quite uniquely placed. I mean, there are a number of other candidates who I think would be good as well, but they all tend to come from the north. And because of their kind of slightly more broad-based appeal. Lisa and Andy would be another one, but again, I digress.
I think what was particularly interesting, and what was, I think, a very strong sign of his suitability for that, was that on a lot of the criticism, a lot of his standing up to the government, his Starmer was echoed. It was Andy Burnham that was leading it, that was actually in charge, taking the front on that. Whereas what you actually want is the leader of the opposition being the one that is coming up with that, and then the Metropolitan Mayor of Greater Manchester actually coming in to support and saying, yes, this criticism has my support. But we had it the other way around.
That's
Instead,
right.
we had the leader of the Labour Party weighing in afterwards to say, yes, I support Andy Burnham.
And he was taking a position on something.
Exactly.
So much of the COVID, the COVID response from Keir Starmer has been, I agree with what the government is doing. I support lockdown. I support, the furlough scheme. I support self-employment, help, etc. But here was an issue that Andy Burnham was able to legitimately come down on the other side of. Okay, of course it's going to piss people off, isn't it? Because some people might not agree with him, but at least you know what he stands for. and that is the route back to power for Labour. It's the only route back, in my opinion.
It's an interesting idea that these metro mayorships may soon be a platform for people to present themselves as future leaders of their parties instead of the traditional route up through Parliament.
I would suggest that it's already happened. I mean, our current Prime Minister was the Mayor of London.
Well, exactly. He could be the. I don't want to use the term patient zero. I think that's in poor taste and under the current circumstances. But you get my meaning.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and if you look at the other side of the coin, the Metro Mayor, is it Tees Valley Metro Mayor Ben Houghton? He's young, 20. Early.
He's been very successful. I mean, I'm no Tory myself, but he's clearly been a very successful Metro Mayor, and he's put forth some policies that would be amenable to long-time Labour voters. He backed the nationalisation of the local airport, for example.
And he's being seen to be, quote, getting shit done, and I say that because that's literally the quote that people have been telling me.
And of course, let's not forget the constituency of Hartlepool falls under his Metro Mayorship.
Right, and so that had part of the reason as to why they now have a Conservative MP.
Yeah, I think I think one thing that I do think is probably worth bringing up with Andy Burnham is that his mayorship has itself not been without its own controversies as well. Like, he has had probably the biggest kind of controversy that he's had has been with the Greater Manchester Police, right, which have been placed into special measures while he was in charge. But I think it's quite telling that despite the Conservatives having that quite strong attack line on him, really, you can say, well, the police have gone to pot while he's been in charge. We've had it's a favorite rhetorical device of the right-wing politicians and far-right politicians in particular to talk about grooming gangs and all that kind of stuff, right? And he hasn't been very good on that with the police. But I think the fact that he's been able to kind of push through that and still come out looking actually stronger than ever politically is really quite telling.
And of course, his political strength beyond the pandemic. There was the Bed Every Night scheme, and there's been his work into mental health in Greater Manchester, and he's really managed to come into his own as a politician since he's been in that role. Whereas before, just remember when he was running against Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, he could have walked that leadership election if he'd, actually presented himself as himself. He'd actually come across as somebody who was going to stand up and say it as it is. But at that point, he didn't. They were still living under new Labour orthodoxy, where he just had to present himself as this plastic, airbrushed 90s cardboard cutout politician. And that just didn't float at the time. He misjudged the mood of the day then. But I think
he's also, he has, I think, it's probably not, it sounds a bit silly, but I think the fact that he is now kind of the face of anyone who's really exasperated or been exasperated with the way that the government's handled the pandemic is familiar with Andy Burnham's exasperated face after having right, that he wouldn't be receiving a funding package. He's become a meme, and it sounds silly.
And there's political fuel in that. That's powerful, because that gets shared among people who don't have more than a passing interest in politics, and having name recognition is a big deal.
Or even meme recognition, Good politicians use the platforms of the day. Think of FDR's fireside chats.
Yeah, absolutely right.
He knew how to use the radio.
Yeah, look at Donald Trump. He knew how to use the television, and he knew how to use social media. And I know we've talked at length about him.
Even though he no longer has that, I know.
Yeah, no, of course. Now
let's not get into Trump for now. I didn't anticipate we'd be coming on to talk about the local elections and end up on Trump.
and yet here we are. Welcome.
And yet here we are. That's just how pervasive he's become.
Indeed.
But let's move on to one of Trump's favourite hot topics, shall we? If it were. The last key component of our discussion today, of course, is Scotland. The SNP, the Scottish National Party, pro-independence, that have been the largest party in Holyrood in the Scottish Parliament for a while now, fell ever so slightly short of a majority in the Scottish Parliament election. They gained one seat, but still short of a majority, even though if you include the Scottish Greens, who are also pro-independence, there isn't a majority for independence in the Scottish Parliament. The Conservatives held on to the same number of seats as they did in the previous time, 31, and Labour suffered a net 2-seat loss. Where does this leave the Scottish independence movement? Is this a defeat for them? Because the SNP didn't get their majority specifically?
I've spent a lot of time in Scotland in the last 5 years since the independence referendum, and I can tell you that there is definitely a disconnect between people who want independence and people who like the way the SNP govern. You've got the only credible progressive party in Scotland at the moment are the SNP, centre left, in terms of their policies, the way they fund things, their social outlook. So anybody who doesn't identify as a Tory is probably this is a mass generalization, and I apologize to all of my lovely Scottish friends. It's probably going to vote for the SNP. Labour is not a credible force in Scotland anymore, and that brings with it a myriad of other problems for Labour's route back to power. But I think, going back to your original question, the independence movement is there's not an appetite for independence in Scotland. The 55-45 was the result in 2014, and I think the most recent opinion polls are about that still. So while a lot of people think the SNP are doing a good job in Holyrood, they perhaps don't want to give them quite enough power to go through another independence referendum again.
It's a very difficult question, I think, because there are still a lot of compelling arguments in favour of it. I think when you have power that is so centralised down in London, even after devolution is kind of coming along sort of as a policy, but at the same time, there's always going to be, like you say, it's breaking away from the status quo. And this is something which has existed for a very, very long time. Breaking up the union would be an enormous moment in the history of the UK. It's not just a huge moment for Scotland.
It dwarfs the leaving the European Union as far as history and culture is concerned, tenfold. 1707, wasn't it, that the union formed? I mean, it's 300 something years of history.
Union, yeah.
So Ed, you're right, and I mean a lot
and even then, that's not the start of whole British. Not what we call today British unionism, but then you have the Commonwealth of England under Cromwell.
Sure, yeah,
and
you've got
Roman days. The idea of an independent Scotland is something that's come and gone through the ages.
It certainly has, yeah.
And politically, there are plenty of moments over the last 5 or so years that really could have been a moment for independence. After the EU vote, obviously Scotland heavily voted to remain. The SNP really pushed that argument. The amount of times I saw Nicola Sturgeon on television saying taking us out of the European Union against our will, she was really trying to make the point that if Scotland was independent, then obviously they wouldn't have left the European Union. But this argument hasn't moved the needle. And I think it's difficult because if you are a centre left voter in Scotland, you are left with not too many options at that level. So there's that disconnect between people who want to remain in the union but like the way centre left politics are run.
I agree. I think there are lots of people who vote for the SNP who aren't in favour of Scottish independence, but just want a Scottish interests party.
Yes.
And people, Scotland only has, 59 seats in Westminster? It's hard to stand up for yourselves in and of itself in Westminster when it's so overwhelmingly dominated by English seats because of the size of the population. If we had an elected upper chamber that was more proportional, then, that might negate the need for, the SNP and the Scottish Parliament, but we don't, and that's where we are.
And I digress, but here becomes this problem, this catch-22 we have. So for Labour not even Labour, just for someone who isn't the Conservative Party to form a government in the House of Commons now, you have to work together. The centre left parties, Labour, the SNP, the Lib Dems, arguably Greens, Plaid, etc., need to have some kind of electoral pact under first past the post. The Tories are at such an advantage, given that they're the only right-leaning party, more or less, in that chamber, so that anybody who is sympathetic to that way of thinking is going to vote Tory. And yeah, I know we're talking about the Scottish elections, but we've digressed again. But there we go.
It's an interesting dilemma for Labour, actually, the prospect of electoral reform. Because on one hand, it could be an easy policy for them to sell, and they say, look, the Progressive Alliance could coalesce around us if there were electoral reform. At the same time, there'll be also people in the Labour Party thinking, Labour is an alliance of convenience in and of itself at the best of times. There are a very broad range of ideologies under Labour's church, which would probably just break apart if we had proportional representation. It would probably be the end of the Labour Party. Possibly. And there'd just be a few parties that would spring out of it.
But then if you look at the Conservative Party up until 2019, there were a lot of broad views in that party as well. You had plenty of Remainer, Anna Soubry type figures, right through to your Jacob Rees-Mogg, your what's his name, Andrew. Oh, I should remember these things. People on the right. And until 2019, until Brexit happened, they were able to kind of work together. And it's only now that those people have been purged from the party that they're all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. But yeah, I mean, you're right that there would be a broad range of voices, but it's a lot harder for Labour to get the majority that they require. And to make some arrangement with the SNP wouldn't be the worst idea, in my humble opinion.
I mean, the big problem with that, though, is that the SNP would demand any Labour government would put forward an independence referendum, which Labour would never do, because then they don't want to be the party that would break up the union.
No.
And let's also not forget that's an electoral suicide for
Andrew Bridget. That's the name of the person.
They would do it with the SNP. Yeah. But I mean, if Labour made it clear they were willing to do a deal with the SNP, then half of them who were amenable to voting Labour would instantly just say, no, I'm voting Tory.
Yeah.
Just because they don't want the end of the union.
Yeah,
that was the quandary Ed Miliband faced in 2015, because it was almost certain he was going to have to do a deal with Alex Salmond to get into government.
Yeah,
but he wasn't prepared to say it because he knew he'd lose half the electorate in England if he did, and lo and behold, he did anyway.
And on the other side of the coin, David Cameron said, "I will hold a referendum if I win," and look where we are 7 years later.
I mean, I don't even.
Well, yes, he never said that if he thought there was any chance he'd lose it, but
yeah, it's a very difficult. Yeah, they're playing three-dimensional chess with themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the big problem, and what gives the Conservative Party such a huge advantage is, I think, that England is or the English are inherently quite socially conservative and quite politically conservatively minded, right? Any kind of reform, any kind of support base is always, Labour have historically always needed the Scottish constituencies, right? You lose that and suddenly, I don't even think, for example, that the loss in England that the Labour would suffer if they allied themselves with the SNP would even go so far as maintaining the union. I think it would just be a kind of base English nationalism, which the Conservative Party has become extremely adept at exploiting. I mean, it is now effectively an English nationalist party. It's no longer the party of kind of economic conservatism that we've seen in the past. It's just a nationalist party now. I think if you can appeal to that,
never underestimate the Conservative Party's ability to adapt and survive.
Definitely.
But that's exactly it. There's no route back. I fail to see any route back to a Labour majority without Labour winning back Scotland. I mean, I don't see the numbers adding up unless Labour manages to swing constituencies it's never swung before.
You'd need 1997 levels of landslide. I think if you...
And I just don't see that happening anytime soon.
No.
I really don't. Unless there's some major economic crisis that can only be pinned on the Tories. There's no way they can deflect the blame.
I think we've had that. Happen. I think that came in the form of COVID-19, and
but the Tories were able to deflect the blame.
Well, indeed.
So something where they can't deflect the blame.
Yeah.
A la Black Wednesday.
Yeah, but, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't. As much as I'd love to see a Labour government again, I don't wish that. And anyway, I mean, people lose their jobs in an economic crisis. People die in an economic crisis. I don't wish that upon the country for partisan reasons.
No. Indeed.
No. Absolutely not.
But just before we go, I think this is a good bit of fun just as we wrap up. So people have been looking at Batley and Spen, another by-election coming up, and saying there have been several people floating the idea of a leadership contest of the Tories take another Labour bulwark here in Batley and Spen. If Keir Starmer's days are numbered, who's your pick?
But that's a difficult question. Are you asking me who I think will become the leader, or are you asking who I would want to be the leader?
Let's take both questions.
Okay, so my pick for the leadership would be Lisa Nandy. She's a woman. Labour has never been led by a woman before, and would unlock a whole bunch of broad-based appeal. She's northern, she's experienced, she's been in the party long enough, but she's also young enough to have that broad-based appeal as well. For me, she ticks the most amount of boxes. She's from Wigan, so she's from the north. She's 39, 40 years old. There are so many advantages to have her as leader. I don't think she would become the leader. I think they're probably more like, I don't know, they could go for, it's a very, very difficult question. They could swing back left again. Somebody like Rebecca Long Bailey could get back in. But going back to that, I don't think Labour are going to lose Batley and Spen. I don't think they are. They've recruited Jo Cox's sister to be the Labour candidate. So who, never mind how she obviously met her tragic end. Jo Cox's sister is obviously going to have links to the area. And I'm positively going to hope that they will have learnt their lessons in terms of projecting a positive vision. So I think what we're talking about is going to be a bit of a moot point.
Yeah, I hope so as well. I hope Labour win Batley and Spen. And, I think there are a few things to give it a background there. Jo Cox was the MP for Batley and Spen, elected in 2015. She was very sadly murdered during the Brexit referendum campaign. She was a Remain supporter, and she was murdered by a far-right English white nationalist terrorist while on the campaign trail. Really sad moment. But even before then, she was a massively respected MP in her constituency, highly committed Labour MP, and of course, Parliament was worse off without her. Really tragic loss. And like you say, her sister is now running there, and I personally wish her all the best. I'm a Labour supporter, so I hope she wins. And on your point about Lisa Nandy, I largely agree with her. I think she would be an excellent pick for leader. I mean, cards on the table, I voted for her myself in the most recent Labour leadership election. To add to your points there, yes, she's young, woman, and I'd also add she's an excellent communicator as well.
I completely agree.
Probably the best communicator and media performer on the Labour front bench right now, I'd add there. So I think I agree she would be an excellent pick.
Also, ethnic minority as well ticks another box.
Absolutely, she is half Indian. I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah,
And of course, the bookmaker's favourite at the moment would be Andy Burnham.
I would weigh in and say that that would probably be my, just for the sake of a bit of variety as well. As much as I do agree with all of the things that we highlighted about Lisa Nandy, I do think that Andy Burnham still he has the public profile. He's proven that he can hold the government to account. He also has previous experience of working on the front bench, and he's kind of a known quantity as well. I think he's got an established vision. He's got that. He's shown that he can kind of challenge the government. I think.
Which, he has said he'd serve a full term as Manchester Mayor.
That is also a problem. He does also need to serve full term as Manchester Mayor before that. So, if we're speaking hypothetically in terms of who I would want, it would be between those two. If we
go really out of left field, and I mean, there's no reason why he couldn't.
Would he serve a full term? I mean, maybe if a by-election in the northwest pops up in the next couple of years, he might. I mean, I think it'll be full blazing cards on the table. He's gunning for the leadership if he stands in a by-election soon.
Yes, yeah, but there's nothing to suggest that he couldn't be the leader of the Labour Party as Manchester Mayor. I mean, who says they have to be an MP? They don't have to be an MP. They just have to be a member of the party. So, but I mean, we digress, and this is obviously.
So then, could you be leader of the opposition if you're not an MP?
Well, quite indeed.
He'd have to nominate a deputy to be.
Yeah, I know. You'd have to say, right, Mr. Nandy can stand opposite the dispatch box every Wednesday afternoon. Yeah, I know.
I'd love to watch that. I think Nandy versus Boris Johnson PMQs would be an absolute firecracker.
Yeah, I bring the popcorn.
Yeah. But on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up there, folks. So thanks very much for tuning in once again. Thank you to our guests, Kit and Richard, and we will see you all soon.